Well, welcome back to the Colonial Garden. We are here in beautiful Williamsburg, Virginia. Our garden sits on the Duke of Gloucester Street, right across from the Bruton Parish Church. And we are the three gardeners who work in this garden. I'm Eve, this is Teal, and this is Megan. And with a volunteer and the help of a few summer interns, we work this garden all year long. So we're here to talk about spring gardening, different way we trellis vegetables, how we turn our soil, and how we use some very particular tools to start our spring garden. So to begin with, I'm going to turn you over to Teal here, and she's going to talk about, what are you going to talk about, Teal? Our garden interpretation.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about our garden site here.
Yep.
So even though we are on Duke of Gloucester Street today, this is probably something you would have seen as the private backyard of a home in the 18th century, and a very wealthy home. This is someone that's trying to impress you. So it's a mix of ornamental flowers, edible vegetables, maybe even some more unusual plants that might have been part of a botanical collection. And this might not even be the main food source for this family. It's very likely they own a plantation for income outside of town. They can be growing more basic food there and bringing it in. They can access food that's being grown by farmers and sold at the markets. So out here they get to do a little bit more experimentation, growing things that are a bit more of a luxury, maybe something that takes, a lot of time or space to grow for what it actually is. And they do consider gardening and botany to be popular hobbies. So in their free time, the wealthy are dabbling in doing some garden work. They're, entertaining their guests in this garden. Maybe they're collecting and trading seeds and plants. But they're not going to be the ones doing all of that physical labor. This does rely on either hired professional gardeners, which is what our trade today represents, as well as labor from the enslaved in those households to make something like this possible. And we're each going to take a minute and kind of tell you about some of the things that we're doing in the garden in the springtime. So Megan, if you want to start off.
Mm-hmm. So the very first thing that we have to do in the spring is actually prepare the soil to plant in. And what we do is a technique called hills and ridges. So as people wander through our gardens, they often ask us why we do that and also how we do that. So I'll go over both of those. Now, the how we do this, first you have to take your spade. So we've got one of them here. And this is what we're going to be using to dig. So it has a nice narrow frame to it, so it can cut through the soil really easily. So we'll turn our soil over, go through the entire area we're going to plant in by turning it over. And then we'll take a garden hoe, we'll chop it up really fine, and then we'll take a rake, we'll smooth it out, and then we'll measure it out with our pin and reel, which is on the table right over here. These are one of our measuring tools that we use. And then we take our rake and our hoe in a combination, and we'll drag that soil up into a long hill or a ridge. And then we can actually plant into that. Now, the why we do that is for two main reasons. Here in Tidewater, Virginia, we deal with a lot of moisture, and that means that rot is one of our number one enemies here. So by digging up the soil, chopping it fine, and making it into a hill or a ridge, it creates this platform that allows water to shine out and away from the roots of our vegetables. Because you can always add water in with a watering can, but you can't take it out once it's there. So that helps with the excess water we deal with here. And then the other reason that we do this is the turning and the chopping makes our soil really fine. So if you want to have really nice root vegetables like the carrots that we've grown here, nice, big, and straight, it's really beneficial to them. So that's how we prepare our soil here in the Colonial Garden. And I'll send you over to Eve now, and she'll talk to you about our hotbeds.
So, and to remind you, as we're going along and talking about these various subjects, please think up some questions to ask us. Because after we're done talking to you, we're going to ask you we want you to ask us some questions about what we're talking about. So I'm going to talk about a hotbed, which is a tool that we use very heavily at the end of the winter before spring. It is a way of starting our seeds. So all of us will go out into the field, and before I go there, I believe there's some pictures that you should be seeing of the hotbed. It's a wooden frame. Has a pit that is a brick lined pit below, which is about 2 feet deep, and then there's a frame. It comes all apart. It's two sides, front and back, and windows. And so that pit faces south, and the pit is filled with composted horse manure. And the composted horse manure, as it's down in there, it's generating heat. We have a layer of soil over the top of it, and with the windows closed and seeds planted in there, that's where our spring garden begins. Let's see what else about the hotbed. So at night you'll get about 4 weeks of heat out of that compost. So of course we have our first hotbed begins we'll go out and collect manure for it about the end of January. By the second week of February we're already putting it into the hotbed, and the plants that we plant in there are generally like our hardier vegetables and hardier flowers. The second hotbed, which follows shortly thereafter, has like tomatoes and peppers and the more tender things like basil. So when they run out of heat, it's usually our frost season is over. And at nighttime, we'll close them up nice and tight, cover them with tarps. And this year, if you come to our garden, we've actually made a straw mat that goes over the top of them that helps insulate them. And next I'm going to give you Teal, and she's going to talk about peas and trellises.
Yeah, so another one of the jobs we're doing in the spring here in the garden is building trellises that will support some of the plants that climb up them during the summer. Peas is probably one of the first things we start with. So we'll use sycamore sticks, and we will make a trellis for those. Other things we'll use trellis for, tomatoes later in the season, our cucumbers, we like to grow those up a trellis. Anything that would otherwise just kind of grow out on the ground. If you grow it on a trellis, you're more likely to get harvestable fruit from it. And it also adds, just another dimension to the garden. You get to take advantage of some vertical space. But we'll often get questions in our garden from guests, walking around town who've seen these really unusual trees. And they have the branch, the bark of a sycamore. So if you are familiar with sycamore, you'd probably recognize the bark. But the branches, instead of having their regular branching habit, end in these really funny knuckles. And I think we've also got some footage of that for you. And what's going on there is it is a sycamore tree, but as it reaches a certain point in its life, they cut back all the small branches to the same point, and it kind of scabs over and forms this knuckle. And that's a pruning technique called pollarding. And pollarding, along with a similar technique, which is coppicing, where you cut something all the way to the ground and get regrowth from that, are techniques coming out of Europe where mature lumber and mature trees are in short supply. So they're actually having to come up with ways to, grow sticks. And so that is the product of that pruning process. Each season, when they cut those branches off, over the course of 1 year, you get these really straight, unbranched sticks, which is perfect for our trellising. So when you visit our garden, all the trellising we're using, as well as a lot of the wattle fencing that we've made in the garden, is using these sycamore branches. And especially in the springtime, they're nice and flexible. So for weaving our wattle, it's the ideal time to do that work. And now we would be thrilled to answer your questions if you have any, especially questions about our spring garden.
Yes.
Well, thanks. So we have a question from Ryan about heirloom seeds. I mean, people talk about that a lot today. Was there any thought about things like heirloom seeds in the 18th century? Was anybody looking back, or we are mostly looking to the present and forward?
Wow. I think that's very much of a mix. I think they are looking forward always. So the gentlemen who are traveling around the world looking for new plants, new varieties, different colors, a different vegetable. And in a gentleman's pleasure garden, they're very much about collecting plants. That's his hobby. So he is going to be interested in different plants. As for saving seeds, sometimes they do it well, sometimes they don't. They lose varieties in the 18th century. Do you have anything to add that you can think about?
I guess to add on to that, they're not trying to freeze a point in history like we are today. So if they can breed something that's bigger, better, tastier, bug resistant, heat resistant, they're going to try and do that. So that's sort of what makes us different today, is that we're trying to go back.
What are some of the things that you're, well, tell us about coming out of winter. You're talking about preparing for spring, but what were you growing over the winter, and what do you have to do with that stuff in the early spring? So what have you been doing recently, I guess?
Yeah, a lot of guests to our garden in the spring are surprised to see how big a lot of the vegetables that we have are. And it's because we have started them in the fall. So our climate here is mild enough that there's a number of things we plant around October. We kind of do a big, spring, this time of year we're doing one big round of planting. We do another one in October with lots of, leafy greens, lots of things in the cabbage family. Our garlic is planted in the fall. And all of those things in the springtime are, reaching maturity. So they're full-grown vegetables. So we can actually keep quite a bit, going through the winter here.
Tina was curious about if people brought live plants, like rootstocks, from Europe and Britain, or just seeds.
So they're actually bringing both over. Now, it is easier to travel with seeds. So we see a lot of letters, particularly from John Custis, who, if you have a chance, go over to the Custis Dig site across from the Art Museum. And he was a very notable gardener here, where he is importing, live plants, sometimes bulbs, sometimes trees even, and seeds coming from Europe and all over the world, actually. And there are incidents where the ship's dog, the ship rats, eat a lot of the bulbs. Some of the seeds will get lost, and salt spray will sometimes get to those plants. So if someone's packing the ship and they don't put it below decks, those live plants are more than likely going to die during the voyage. So it is something that we see during this time period them doing, but how many are actually making it over here alive for the live plants is a very small percentage, and I can't give an exact number on that, but it's not great. So we see mostly seeds being shipped over.
So if I may add to that, so John Custis is one of my favorite people to talk about, and he actually is writing back and forth to Peter Collinson in England, and they are recommending that plants be dug up, planted in cases that are 2 feet by 2 feet, holes in the bottom to allow drainage, and same thing, they also plant in baskets. They'll grow them for a period of time until they're well rooted, then they'll put them on the ship and they'll arrive here. And Peter Collinson recommends, and Custis also, it's best to bury the whole box or basket, that the wood or basket will rot. So we see quite a bit of that. And that's what's so exciting about the archaeological dig, is they did find some dark soil that was 2 feet wide. So I'm really hoping that it might be something like that. But that's my wish.
So speaking of spring, everybody likes to think about tulips. Chris was curious if you could tell us a little about tulips in the 18th century and planting them and growing them.
So tulips are Turkish originally, and the Dutch take up the growing of tulips and turn it into, actually in, I think it's 17th century, tulipomania in England and Europe. People go crazy for tulips. They pay inordinate amounts of money, but in a high-level garden, as you would have here in the colony, you would most likely be bringing in tulips. Again, Mr. Custis loves pink double tulips, I believe is his thing that he likes. A lot of the patterns of the tulip are either this more of a striped, they call it a broken tulip, and that's literally a virus that is in the tulip that allows that striation of color. Anything you might want to add to that?
I mean, there's, they are still, even though it's not quite the craze, of that earlier time period, they're still very popular, garden plants here in the 18th century. So you probably would have seen them, maybe not to the degrees that we have them planted today. We're just able to do a lot more today with them. In our garden in particular, we kind of struggle with, wet soil and hot weather, which can really not be the ideal growing conditions for tulips. So at our site, we have a number of heirloom varieties that are actually 18th century varieties, and instead of planting them directly into the ground, we actually plant them in pots at our site and really show them off in individual clay flower pots.
Well, speaking of flowers, Tiffany was wondering what your favorite edible flowers are.
Oh my goodness. Oh.
Yeah. We have a lot, actually. And we do see that coming straight out of the 18th century. I mean, if you can afford to grow some more luxury vegetables to have things like salad, we do see them eating edible flowers. I hope I'm speaking for all of us when I say I think nasturtium, which they're calling Indian cress in the time period, is probably our favorite. Because it's a beautiful flower, but it also has a really pungent, spicy flavor, just like a radish. And it's a pretty quick one to start in your garden. No matter where you are right now, it's probably something you could add to your garden for this season. Calendula, which we actually have on the table in front of us here, which is being called pot marigold in the 18th century, is edible. It adds beautiful color to salad, not as flavorful. We grow borage, which has kind of a cucumber flavor, and a small blue flower that's very dainty on a salad. You can eat all sorts of petals of, violas or Johnny jump ups. You can candy some of them. So there's a use of flowers certainly as edibles in the 18th century, and we grow a lot of those today.
So Kat and others were wondering about watering a garden. You just water it with a can. We've talked about an overabundance of water, but is there any system for watering a garden back then, or what do you all do today? You just go around with a watering can, or?
Right here. We do all the hand watering here. And during the 18th century, they're drawing water up from a well, and then they're filling these big cisterns, which you can see behind us there. That holds about 200 gallons of water. And then you dip your watering can into that cistern, and then you would go and you would water the garden wherever you need it. And that is a huge amount of labor, and that would be something that gardeners would be doing, and a lot of enslaved people as well. A gallon of water weighs roughly 8 pounds, and we have 2 of these cisterns, and we can easily empty them both during a drought. And we do see that happening in the 18th century, where they're very concerned with the water. And you have teams of people who are pulling water up from the wells and trying to fill the cisterns to make sure that the garden, doesn't die. But for the 3 of us here, we're doing all of the hand watering, and it is quite a lot of labor for our garden. So modernly, we have it pretty easy with hose hookups and things in our gardens at home, and a sprinkler can move a ton of water much faster than the 3 of us can. So that's one of those things that we definitely shouldn't take for granted today. It's a lot easier to turn that spigot than to haul the water up from the well.
And that's also another a sign of wealth, that you have the enslaved people that will pull that water from the well, fill the cistern, and water your garden. Everyone else is just hoping for rain. So if you have wealth like in our garden, that's how that's how you're watering your garden.
What about keeping pests away? Kevin and Susie were curious. What do you do to keep animals out of your vegetables?
Oh my. So for the 4-footed pirate, we try to put up some sort of a barrier system. So we're using netting, which we don't like to use, but any kind of a barrier method like a glass or hand light. We use that. We also use smell, so we'll do something like the composted chicken manure. It's quite smelly, and that'll keep the deer away for a while, squirrels away. But we're very vigilant while we're here, and that's for those types of creatures. And then for insects, we have an inspection routine. We know which plants are usually plagued by some sort of an insect that we have to, like a squash bug or something like that. And we will go out every morning. It's usually the first thing, as we will inspect the leaves and literally just squish the eggs. And if you can catch an adult and squish it, that's all the better. But it's all hand done.
So in one of the video clips that we showed while you were talking about things earlier, we saw some glass domes. Erin was curious if you could tell us a little bit about those.
Yeah, those are probably, you saw the bell glasses, which are hand blown round covers for individual plants. And that's something that, going into the early spring when our weather can be kind of unpredictable here, we can keep those on hand to cover plants to protect them from frost. And we can also use those kind of to create a small greenhouse effect over a new transplant or seedling. They're very good at trapping moisture and cutting, drying winds. So really just to kind of give things a boost in the springtime. But we have used them to successfully grow lettuce all winter, just from keeping frost off the leaves in the evening. But anytime you see glass in a garden, especially over something kind of a little bit frivolous like a salad, that's someone trying to show off. All glass in Virginia is going to be imported from England, so you're looking at a sign of wealth to have that.
Related, going back to pests now, Carolyn is curious if you would plant something like marigolds to discourage insects, and Tiffany was wondering in particular about how to get rid of ants in a garden.
Oh my.
So we do plant marigolds, but that's more because they're ornamental and they're pretty. We have seen our rabbit here in the garden make eye contact with us and eat the marigold, so it definitely doesn't keep the rabbits away. But for insects, I personally haven't found many references to them interplanting like that, other than it's already in the garden because it's beautiful. And then with ants, I'm not entirely sure how we would keep them away in the 18th century.
So I've read tansy will do something to keep them away, but I can't vouch for that is true.
Yeah. And I will say that making friends with the birds in your garden, so feeding them, we found that peanuts are very favorable, but black oil sunflower seeds, attracting birds to your garden will help at least a little bit in keeping some of the insect population down. But just for ants, I personally don't really know too much about them.
So what about, since so much of this gardening was done by people for themselves, how many professional gardeners do we actually know about? How do we learn about them? How do we learn about techniques? Is there a lot of writing on the subject in a period to educate the amateur gardener?
So we do know a little bit about the gardeners, maybe at the Palace and William and Mary, they're named. We also know some of the enslaved that are gardeners. So we know James is loaned from Carter's Grove, and he is brought up to work in the Palace Gardens. We know Ferguson or Farquharson at the Palace, and I forget who was at William and Mary.
There are lists. Unfortunately, not too many published together, but certainly in our records here for the Palace, we have some of the names of the gardeners.
Yeah. And then if you want to get into the 18th century methods of gardening, so once you find one man's books, you will usually trip upon many of them. So Philip Miller publishes, I think, 8 or 9 editions of a garden dictionary, and that is a wonderful place to begin. He is at the Chelsea Physic Garden, and it's A to Z, everything about gardening. There's also John Evelyn, who publishes, it's published after his death, Elysium Britannicum, and he also has Elysium or Silva on trees and a Cetteria for salads, and that's where you find out in the 17th century vinegar and oil was very popular as a salad dressing. But a lot of these garden gentlemen, once you hook into that vein, you kind of learn who their contemporaries were. There's some very nice books. Andrea Wolf writes about gardeners, and a lot of their old books are now online or reprinted. So it's a little tough to get through the language sometimes, but very interesting techniques. So when you're talking about pests, there is a time that John Evelyn believed that earthworms were harmful, and in one of his books he goes into how you get rid of earthworms. So reader beware, some of the advice is very old.
And there is, even John Randolph, who lives in Williamsburg, actually publishes a small garden treatise or kind of how-to book, and he's kind of plagiarizing some sources from England, which there's different copyright laws, of course, in the time period, but it's really interesting to see what things he does change for the Virginia audience versus, what they're seeing in England, and that is still available, and I think if you just look up John Randolph Garden Treatise, you should be able to find it.
Yeah, and I think Joseph Prentice as well, one of our local gardeners here, or gentleman who gardens. And Richard Bradley, the bad boy of garden plagiarism in the 18th century.
Let's play like garden helpline for a second here. So Lori, I think wants to have much better luck than she has in growing beans. So what are give some good advice for Lori to help her grow beans successfully?
So not knowing where she lives, probably the best advice is your soil needs to be rather on the warm side. So 60 degrees is a great place to start. Something that is nicely tilled, loose soil. When it's dry, water. But probably the biggest thing is people are very anxious to plant their beans early in the year. They'll put them in too early, and they just sit there and rot. So wait until it warms a little bit. And then there's wonderful modern varieties, bush beans if you don't want to build a trellis. If you want to grow some of the heritage varieties or some of the pole beans, those are delicious. You'll have to figure out how to build some sort of a trellis. That's probably the best thing I have.
Yeah. And depending on where she lives, she can look up her local extension service. So each state has a gardening extension service, usually staffed by master gardeners, and they'll be able to give you much more directed and focused information because we're zone 7B, which the zones are all based on temperatures. And for us, that means the lowest average temperature we see is going to be 10 degrees. And it usually doesn't even get that low for us. So if you're further up north, you're going to have a completely different planting schedule than we do, and same as if you're further down south. So definitely look into your local extension agency, or if you have a local botanical garden as well.
And they can also help, if you're having issues with, soil health. A lot of the extension agencies also offer soil testing services, which if you've got, just nothing is doing great in your garden, it might be worth doing a soil test just to make sure everything is in proper order.
This moves a little bit into sort of some of the area where you overlap with our farmers and our food waste folks. But Erin has a question about what winter would have looked like in regards to produce for the residents of Williamsburg. Was there much being prepared and put on shelves, or are they importing things? Can you paint that picture for us a little bit?
So I think class defines how you're gardening and what you're farming. So in our situation, this is a man who has has wealth because he's enslaved as his workforce. He can water, he has the glass, he can afford lettuce in the wintertime and an artichoke in the summer and delightful melons in the summer and all sorts of, very luxury vegetables. And it's something like 90% of the population is farming, and a lot of that is very subsistence farming. So that's growing just enough to meet your needs. They're putting food by, they're pickling, drying. So a winter squash would be kept grown in the summer, fall, and eaten all the way into January and February. Root crops as well are storage crops. What else?
I mean, we're growing a lot of leafy greens and root vegetables during our winter here, so pretty much everything you see on the table, with the exception of the asparagus, which has started to come up the last few weeks, we actually overwintered in our garden. So for winter gardening here, for a colonial gentleman, you'd be seeing things like beets, parsnips, turnips, carrots. You'll be seeing collards and kale, broccoli. We've got our purple broccoli down there. And then you'd be seeing things like chard and, kohlrabi even. So to have that much fresh green would be a real treat. But your average person at the time, they'd mostly be eating off of their stores and probably growing some kale or cabbages. But to have this much variety, that's a huge symbol of wealth right there.
I think meat and grain is most people's diet. One pot meals, something you can just scoop up, and corn is very popular as a corn pone or corn bread.
Yeah, and canning like we have and that develops in the 19th century is not happening yet. So if you want to preserve something, there is a little bit of pickling going on, but pressure canning is not possible. So it's got to be something that can really last on its own.
Kay was curious about modern, contemporary sources now for finding heirloom seeds. How do you begin to get into gardening historically?
So Mr. Google is your friend. If you put in a search for heritage seeds, there is Seed Savers Exchange, Baker Creek. Once you find one, you'll start to kind of trip on all of it. Make sure you put heritage seeds in there, and you'll find a good supply of very nice heritage. There's also places like True Love Seeds and Roughwood Seeds. Some other museums also carry seeds. So I know Colonial Williamsburg sells seeds online. So does Monticello. and usually there'll be some sort of a story attached to it that tells you when the vegetable was popular and who grew it. One very nice thing we're seeing lately that I think is wonderful is you're starting to see seed companies sell like the African diaspora seeds or our native Three Sisters garden for our indigenous people. So a lot of opportunities to try something you've never tried before that looks very different than what you're used to, but tastes really delicious.
And there's also a very good book that was written by one of the gentlemen that started this garden, Wesley Green, and it's Vegetable Gardening the Colonial Williamsburg Way, and he actually does give very specific recommendations for varieties. You know, he talks about the varieties that were grown in the 18th century and then kind of gives some suggestions for modern varieties that you can track down if you're specifically trying to recreate an 18th century garden.
Jackie was curious about your schedule. What does your sort of calendar look like for the year in terms of what you're planting when and so forth?
Well, for a lot of our planting, we tend to, for some of them, we put them toward holidays. So for Valentine's Day, we'll plant peas. Since we're in the area we're in, we can do that. And that seems pretty early to a lot of people from northern regions, but peas like our cold weather here. So Valentine's Day, those go in the ground. St. Patrick's Day, our potatoes. And then on Halloween, we usually plant our garlic. So everything is going to be dictated by what the weather is like. We actually put our peas in probably about 2 weeks after Valentine's Day just because it was so wet. And it's also going to be dictated again by your zone. So for spring planting, we are doing a lot of the peas. We're just put in radishes not too long ago, our potatoes as well, onions. We're about to plant another round of carrots and turnips. And then we've already got our summer things started in our hotbeds. So we've got our peppers, tomatoes, some eggplants. We have a lot of ornamental flowers started as well and some herbs. And we'll be putting those in the ground hopefully in the next few weeks. So we're waiting kind of for the nighttime temperatures to be a little bit more consistent, as we had a bit of a cold snap and it didn't get down to freezing, but it got really close in some nights. So it's better to err on the safe side. But for summer, we'll be seeing a lot more of those kind of tender things going out. And then in the fall, we'll be planting our big rounds of leafy greens and root vegetables. So things like the collards and the cabbage and the kale and more carrots, of course, and beets and things like that.
And, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good.
So to add to that, a great way for you to manage if you're growing a wide assortment of vegetables is we actually keep a garden calendar. So it's a journal that tells us what we do every single day. And then we actually kind of to add to that, we have a list of what we plant and when we plant. So like for example, this year when we want to plant something, we'll go back and we'll look and see when did we plant that last year? Was it successful? Was it too cold? Do we need to move it back 2 weeks or forward? But it's a great way to keep track of your successes and something that's not successful and make better planning for the year after that. So with those tools, you're better. It might seem like a whole lot of work, but when you're standing there with a packet of seeds and your ground's ready and you're like, oh, what did I do last year? It's a great way to keep track.
And probably one of the other more important dates too to keep track of is your first and last frost date, and which you can find very easily if you put in your zip code. You can track that down. For us, April 15th, we should be in the clear. So that really dictates a lot of, when we plant things, when we get things ready, so that we can plant them out after that date. And again, kind of planning for the fall in the same way. If we start something that's very tender a week before we're expecting frost, it's not going to make it. So it saves you some effort.
So I think we have time for one last question, and maybe a good place to end would be to think about the other side of the spring, heading into summer. What's coming up for you in the coming months? What are you looking forward to? Any new big things going on in the garden this year?
Well, we can actually talk about one project and 2 new gardens. So we are going to plant a Three Sisters garden this summer. And we'll have our indigenous folks here in programming come and join us. We also will be putting in an African diaspora garden. which we're very excited about. More news to come on that. And our carpenters were here today, and they are putting up a new grape arbor. Our old one it's done, and it's about ready to go. So to hold our grapes up, the carpenters came today, and they're going to construct. They started digging holes today, and by Thursday we hope that'll be up. So we're very excited about that. It's going to be beautiful. The old one was made from locust logs. This one is made from squared up cedar. So it's going to be serviceable and really beautiful. So something to hold up all those muscadine grapes that we grow. Anything else you'd like to add?
Thank you so much, all of you, for standing in the sun and sharing your knowledge with all of us watching along. This program, of course, was made possible through the generosity of our donors, for which we are grateful. To learn how you can support presentations like this, follow the link pinned to the comments below, or join us at colonialwilliamsburg.org. Ladies, do you have any final thoughts for everybody watching along?
Thank you for joining us, and come visit us, see all the good things we have going on in the garden. We'd love to see you.
Thank you.
Yep, thank you.